Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, WTFW with another fiction. What if Deku had lost his dream of becoming a hero? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku dear, Inko had called from the front door, already slipping on her shoes as she waited for her son. It wasn't long before he came running out, a smile on his face and an All Might toy in hand. His messy curls that he got from his father bounced nonstop with him, as Izuku vibrated where he stood. Inko laughed at her son's excitement, giving him a warm smile, ruffling his hair as she said, "Let's get going, Izu. Time to see what's going on with that quirk of yours." Izuku's smile faded for just a moment, before he dramatically shook his head, the smile back on his face, small hands clutching onto the All Might toy even harder. "Yeah, I bet I'm gonna have a super cool quirk. That way Kaken and I can both be heroes together. We'll be as strong as All Might," Izuku declared, holding his toy towards the ceiling. "Of course, dear," Inko replied, sitting Izuku down and handing him his shoes. He got them on, but was far too excited to spend time trying to tie his own laces. So, with a small laugh, Inko sat Izuku down again and tied his laces for him. Once she was done, she rested her hands on Izuku's knees for a moment, and then said, "All right, we have a train to catch. Let's get going, shall we?" "Yeah." And with that, the two were out the door, Izuku keeping somewhat close, but always ahead of Inko. He was playing some kind of hero game with his toy, shouting out random catchphrases some Inko knew, and others not so much, and the occasional, "And that's one villain down, All Might sir. Another good day of keeping citizens safe." She really needed to go back to monitoring what he was watching, because she could have sworn all he was seeing was All Might videos. The same one on loop, just about every night, as soon as Izuku had finished his dinner. It didn't even matter if Inko had finished her own dinner or not, because Izuku was up the second he finished eating, tugging her to his room to pull up the video. Maybe his friends were trying to keep him interested in other heroes as well. It definitely wasn't Katsuki trying to get Izuku interested in other heroes. Not when the boy was just as equally obsessed with All Might. Mitsuki's son may try to hide it a bit more than Izuku by at least making sure he had things other than All Might merch to wear. But it was well known by anyone who talked to the boy for less than a minute that he too had a fascination with the symbol of peace. Inko held her bag, which was just hanging on one of her shoulders, tightly between her fingers, looking around on the street they were walking on. It was a quiet day, and that was something Inko was appreciative of. She had a less busy route that she often took whenever she needed to take the train, but with how little was going on today, she and Izuku were taking a slightly quicker route, closer towards the busier streets. As she looked ahead again, she noticed Izuku getting further again, smiling as she shook her head. It was getting to be a very common thing that he would run ahead of her, too lost in his daydreams of being a hero, working side by side with his idol. For now, though, he would just be running with his toy in hand, and Inko could have some more time to worry just a little bit less about her son, knowing that he was safe at home with her, able to run around with his friends instead of worrying about what villain fight to throw himself into next. She did wonder what his quirk would be. Inko wasn't too sure about how strong it would be, but at least having one would certainly make Izuku feel better. "Izuku dear, don't run too far," Inko called, her smile faltering as Izuku rounded a corner, already knowing the path to the train by heart. And with such a quiet day, he was sure to be safe. There hadn't been a single sign of a villain on their path so far, and there had been a few patrolling heroes too. Not to mention, it was a nice day outside. But it was a mother's instinct to worry, and Inko often felt she worried more than most. The other mothers she talked to didn't seem to mind their kids running around without supervision outside, as long as they stuck with their friends if they planned on going far. Inko, on the other hand, hardly ever wanted to let Izuku out of her sights, especially when he was already accident-prone in their own home, tripping over anything that slightly stood out. And then there was her worry about if his quirk would be able to help him fulfill his dreams, the ones that had Inko wringing her fingers tightly at the thought of them. She didn't want his path to be more complicated. Hoped he could get something that made it easy. Maybe if it was made easy for him, she could worry less. Mitsuki seemed confident that Katsuki's quirk would be wonderful in the heroics field, and Katsuki seemed to agree wholeheartedly. Inko was then suddenly pulled out of her train of thought at the screeching sound coming from the street Izuku had recently turned onto. She immediately broke into a run, clutching her bag tighter as she turned the corner, dark eyes frantically scanning over the street for her boy. And then she saw the head full of green curls, slammed right against the wall that the car had crashed into. If there were any other noises outside of the scream she let out as she continued to run to her son, she wasn't aware of them. She was far too focused on her boy, and the way he slid to the ground, limp, as the car was pushed back. Inko hit the ground hard, scraping her knees as she reached for Izuku, pulling him close and checking for his little heartbeat and signs of breathing. There was nothing. She screamed louder, ignoring the hand on her shoulder that was probably trying to tell her they were calling for an ambulance or trying to give some kind of advice to help her son. All of these things that would feel irrelevant when she knew he had so quickly died. Maybe there was some kind of chance for him, someone who could bring him back. But nobody had stepped forward to help her. No miracle doctor who was just so happening to walk down the street and would run to her son's rescue. Between her sobs and the wait for the ambulance, she looked around on the street, not bothering to spare any kind of glance to the driver who had hit her son. And then she saw it. The all-might toy, stranded in the middle of the street, just between the skid marks the car's tires had made. Her clumsy boy must have dropped it, didn't he? He dropped it and jumped into the street without thinking twice. Her sweet, clumsy, and brave child was gone. She didn't need to wait for the people in the ambulance to tell her that. Hospitals smelt far too clean for Inko's preference. At home, there was always some kind of smell going through the air, but never the cleaners she had used. None of the chemicals she had used to try and make sure the house was clean, despite it only being her and a 4-year-old there. Inko and Izuku were often the people going to visit others, guests a rarity in their apartment. But she still liked to keep it clean, especially when she was often home alone. Hisashi has been overseas for work for so long, and Izuku was often with his friends whenever he wasn't at preschool. Though, whenever she was done cleaning the home, she would either cook or bake something, typically with a smell strong enough that it would cover up the smell of the chemicals. Izuku had always seemed to appreciate those cleaning days, enjoying the food that he would come home to and happily eat. Who was she going to share food with now? When she and Izuku made it to the hospital, all they did was confirm what she knew, that Izuku was dead. There was nothing they could do. It really made her wonder why she was in the hospital for so long now, with the sun already set, and her usual dinner time having passed nearly an hour ago. And now she was waiting, clinging onto the intact all-might toy as if it was her lifeline. Mitsuki and Masaru had insisted on picking her up from the hospital, and that she would be staying with them for a while, until they were sure that she was okay. In an attempt to not become a burden to her friend, she had tried to insist over the phone that she would be okay. But the sobs that heaved through her every word gave her away instantly, and there wasn't much of an argument she could put up against her best friend. Especially when Mitsuki was such a strong-minded woman, who would stand firmly on whatever she believed the right course of action would be. So Inko was going to be staying with the Bakugos. "Inko," Mitsuki said as she walked up, her voice low as she looked at her friend. Mitsuki frowned at the sight of her friend, expression sympathetic as she continued to walk over, taking a seat next to Inko on the bench the second she was close enough. The green-haired woman was pulled into a hug, where her crying picked up once more at the gesture. Inko could only imagine how much of a mess she looked like right now, after crying nearly non-stop for the past few hours. Mitsuki slightly rocked the both of them while she held onto the hug, running her fingers through Inko's hair with the hand closest. Once Inko calmed down enough, Mitsuki asked, "What all have they said?" Inko bit her lip, trying to stop it from quivering, as it had been doing for a while now. With a deep inhale, she started trying to explain the situation to her friend, how they were keeping Izuku for another few days, while they finished up their reports, and then she could start planning the funeral. The funeral. God, she wasn't ready for that part. Then there was also all of the injuries Izuku had gotten, all of them together, ultimately killing her son. She wasn't ready to say those out loud, really solidify them. But it was a mess of internal and external bleeding, and so many of his little bones broken. I can't do this, Inko cried, clinging onto her friend's shirt. I thought I'd have so much more time with my boy. That I'd go first. Mitsuki actually didn't seem to be able to say anything. A woman so full of words, and all she could bring herself to do was rub soothing circles on Inko's hands, eyebrows furrowed as she took in the information. Inko heaved out a disbelieving laugh, saying, "It doesn't even really feel real, just why yet? But it hurts so much because this has been a worry for so long. But this is so soon." The two fall into silence again, other than the slowing cries from Inko. Once the crying came to a near stop, the blonde woman quietly led her friend outside the building, where they both got into their respective seats in the car, starting their drive back to the Bakugo residence. It was about halfway through their trip that Mitsuki's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, and she asked, "Have you called Hisashi yet?" "Ah, right, her husband. She did have to tell him, didn't she?" The hospital probably hadn't thought to call him since she, Izuku's mother, was already there. The job fell on her, and she wasn't ready to tell another soul that in the brief moment that Izuku was out of her sight, she lost him. Permanently. So she shakes her head, frowning as she bunched up the hem of her skirt between her shaking fingers. "I can call him, if you would like," Mitsuki offered. When she spared a glance over to Inko, the green-haired woman just gave a small nod in response. "All right, then that's what I'll do tonight. It should be about time for Hisashi to get up anyway. You just get some rest. I'll bring dinner up to you too." When Mitsuki got home, she did her best to quietly get Inko inside, as well as the suitcase she had put together when they had briefly taken a stop at the Midoriya apartment. It was getting late, so the house was relatively quiet. Up until it wasn't. The moment that Mitsuki turned on the entryway light, the sound of someone running around upstairs and then making their way downstairs was quickly known. Soon enough, Katsuki was there, with Masaru not far back, trying to grab their son and bring him back to bed. Mitsuki spared a glance at Inko, trying to see how her friend was doing. The situation that would usually have Inko at least grinning at Katsuki's antics had done nothing to lighten up Inko's mood, instead bringing a slight frown and those watery eyes back. Mitsuki knew that Katsuki wouldn't be the best person to bring to Inko so soon, not when their boys were so close. "Katsuki," Mitsuki started, giving her son a disappointing frown. "You're supposed to be in bed." The boy scowled at his mother before storming his way over to Inko, mouth already opening to ask her something. Surprisingly, it was Masaru who grabbed their son, covering his mouth to prevent whatever question it was from coming out. There was a reason Katsuki was supposed to be in bed already. He was sure to ask about Izuku, question where he was, what the doctor had said about Izuku's quirk, and so much more. There was no way that they wanted Inko to undergo the questioning of a 4-year-old already, especially since Mitsuki and Masaru still had to figure out how to tell Katsuki that Izuku was dead. Was there any easy way to break that to a child? That their friend was dead? It really didn't feel like it. And then Masaru had dropped Katsuki with a sharp intake of air, his left hand flying to the right, which had been keeping Katsuki from asking anything. "Damn brat," bit Masaru. Now it was Mitsuki's turn to take care of Katsuki. The moment he ran close, she managed to grab him with practiced ease. Times like these were becoming more and more common the longer he had his quirk, and Mitsuki was beginning to get tired of the attitude and the constant defiance to whatever she said. Masaru was the one still trying to be patient with Katsuki though, his patience always beating her own. But if Katsuki was lashing out at Masaru already, just to ask a question that he thought he couldn't wait for, Mitsuki was going to step in. So she held her son at her hip and quickly took him back up the stairs. He squirmed in her hold, but being 4 years old, there wasn't much he could do. Sure, he had a quirk, but it was a quickly learned lesson to not use it in the house. And Katsuki had given that lesson to himself when he burnt one of his All Might posters a few months ago. As soon as they were in his room, Mitsuki gently sat him on his bed, sitting in front of him. She would let him talk first this time, let him get out what he wanted. Katsuki seemed to wait for her to talk, but realized pretty quickly what she was doing. Why does Auntie Inko look so upset? And where's Izuku? Katsuki asked. Was he really just wanting to check on Inko? That was why he was fighting so hard to get to her. Maybe Izuku was the priority until he saw how Inko looked. Kiddo. She really hated trying to think of the best way to describe what was going on, especially when she hadn't even gotten to talk to Masaru yet. She let out a long sigh and said, "Something happened today, and it's not something we're going to tell you when you're supposed to be asleep. This is a conversation for a well-rested child." "But then I'll be wondering all night," Katsuki protested. "Well, you won't be wondering if you're sleeping," Mitsuki retorted. Her son frowned at her, crossing his arms and trying to pull her into a staring contest. She played along with it for a bit, before making him blink by blowing in his face. Katsuki let out an upset shout before softly kicking Mitsuki away. "Hey! You cheated. You're not supposed to cheat. And you're supposed to be sleeping." It was the frown that her son gave her that made her feel bad, and the way he hung his head as he turned to tuck himself in. "Auntie Inko is hardly ever sad, and she looks sadder than I've ever seen," Katsuki whispered. That was what had Mitsuki ready to break down. So she pulled her son into a tight hug, so grateful that she still had her boy. It felt so selfish to think that way, especially when her best friend was downstairs mourning her own son. But she wanted to cling to her son more than ever. It was like a huge slap about just how important he was to her, even if the temper he had developed made it difficult to keep trying to stay close. But she was going to do her damn best. Her fingers dug into his shirt as she pulled him tight, up until Katsuki was pushing her off, saying, "You're being weird, old hag." Maybe taking herself to bed would have been nice by now. "All right, brat. Off to bed with you." She ruffled his spiky hair, and then walked out of his room, shutting the door behind her. As she got back downstairs, she could hear Masaru talking. Getting closer to the kitchen, she could hear Inko talking too, her voice quiet and raspy from all of her crying. Once she was in the kitchen, she could see Inko crying again, this time just a steady amount of tears as she made an attempt to eat the dinner that Masaru had heated up. "I just don't want to be a burden on you guys," Inko had said, replying to something Masaru said that Mitsuki hadn't heard while she was walking up. But Mitsuki was smart enough to know what she was talking about. "Inko, us having you stay with us is no big deal, let alone a burden on us. Our job gives us more money than we need most of the time, and we both know you hardly ask for much anyway. Just let us do this for you while you heal." The green-haired woman just went back to solemnly eating her food, eventually letting herself be led to the room that the Masaru had set up for her, while Mitsuki went to grab Inko. The All Might toy never left her sights after the hospital, either in her purse or in her hands. When she was led upstairs, it was clutched tightly in both of her hands, and was only set down when Mitsuki tried to get Inko settled for the night. None of the Bakugos saw her emerge much from the room for days after that. Katsuki had been difficult to handle the next day, basically demanding answers. The best that Mitsuki and Masaru could manage, with Masaru keeping control over the conversation, being trusted to handle the heavier topics better, had been Izuku isn't coming back from the hospital, and Auntie Inko is really sad about it. So I think it's for the best that we don't talk about him much for now, and help her cheer up, okay? But what she needs for now is some space. Their son had reluctantly accepted that explanation, but quickly ran outside, saying something about how he was going to go spend time with his friends. He didn't come back home until dinner, and didn't look much better himself. Mitsuki wondered what was going on in his head, how he had processed the conversation. But if he really wanted to talk about it, he would. If there was anything she could trust her son to be, it would be honest and open when he knew he needed to be. It was on the third day that Inko came running out of the room, phone in hand, while she slipped on a jacket, clumsily running to the door as she slipped on her flats that had been sitting in the entrance ever since she had gotten to the Bakugo household. Mitsuki quickly pushed herself off of the couch, where she had been watching TV with Masaru, waiting for Inko to come down for lunch so they could head out later to finish up some paperwork at the hospital and officially start preparing things for the funeral. Inko? Inko, where are you going? Mitsuki was beyond concerned as her friend rushed out the door. She would never admit it to Inko, but she was beyond worried to leave the woman alone, especially so soon after she lost the child that had become her entire world. Mitsuki knew Inko before either of them became mothers, and the way Inko had changed when she had Izuku had been one of the sweetest things to Mitsuki, remembering how fond she had been of Katsuki when he was first born too. Soon enough, so many of their conversations were about their children, and neither of them seemed to mind. With Katsuki getting older, Mitsuki was trying to give her boy a little bit more space, especially when he was spending time with his friends. She didn't want to supervise his every action, let him learn from his own mistakes. And the way he had insisted on his personal space had definitely helped in that decision. But Inko had just about always hovered around Izuku. It was Mitsuki who had to tell Inko that it was okay to let Izuku out of the house without much supervision, that she didn't need to try to keep some kind of hold on him at all times. It took a while, but soon enough, Inko tried to step back a bit, but always kept a watchful eye out. And that watchful eye wasn't enough this time, and Mitsuki could only imagine the regret Inko was feeling, the way she was beating herself up over it. That was exactly why Mitsuki was so nervous when Inko was running off, not a single word about where she was going. Inko? Mitsuki called again, quickly putting on her slippers and running out the door, chasing her friend, and eventually catching up to her, grabbing the green-haired woman by one of her arms. Inko twirled around, fingers tightly grasping onto Mitsuki's arms as she said, "The doctors said that Izuku is awake, that his quirk manifested, Izuku awake." Mitsuki's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. She hadn't ever heard of a quirk manifestation saving someone like this, when it had already been days after the death. What she knew is that she needed answers, and she wasn't going to let Inko get them on her own. She pursed her lips for a moment as she tried to think over what was happening. Some other thing that the doctor could have said that had maybe tricked Inko into thinking that Izuku was alive. A poor choice of wording on their end that had provided false hope. "Well, you're definitely not going to be running there. Come on, let me drive you," Mitsuki said, tugging her friend back to the house, where Inko practically rushed into the passenger seat, clinging onto her phone tightly as she waited for Mitsuki to get in herself, buckled up and ready to go. Neither of them talked during the drive, both too curious about what was going on with Izuku. Inko had always wanted to believe that a quirk would be what kept her boy safe. It seemed that the one thing she had wanted to hope for when Izuku was so intent on putting himself in such a risky field had happened. If the call she was given by the doctors said anything, he was alive. And even though she didn't get to see or hear him over the call, she wanted to believe that she truly was okay, that this wasn't some sick joke. She could tell Mitsuki was wondering the same as her, how a quirk manifestation had saved her son from death when he was 3 days in the door. But Inko wouldn't question it if she got to hold her child again. Well, she'd most likely question it later, when she had made sure that Izuku really was alive and okay. Mitsuki's expression said plenty of her concerns in the frequent glances she gave. Things like how Inko shouldn't get her hopes up too much, how she probably didn't hear right. Maybe all that Inko heard was that she can take Izuku back, have his body for his funeral. Her initial excitement had fallen the longer she was in the car, her frantic need to just run to the hospital. The longer the ride took, and the longer that Mitsuki and Inko stayed quiet, the less she wanted to firmly believe that her boy was alive. It had been difficult to come to terms with the fact that he was dead at all. She had mourned the words she'd been told, but to actually believe them, feel that they were true, was a whole other matter. Even though she could hardly believe it, a smile was still so hard for her, especially when in every instance she had made an attempt. She couldn't help but think about Izuku. She had felt so horrible whenever any of the Bakugos said something that made her smile, and so she would force the smile away. Why smile when she felt so guilty about Izuku's death? If she had called to keep him closer, held his hand on the way to the train, he would have been fine. Their visit to the hospital would have been for an entirely different reason. The second the two of them were in the hospital driveway, Inko didn't even wait for her friend to fully park before she was out the door, rushing towards the entry. She didn't even need to rush to the desk, not when Izuku was right there in the hospital entry, held by one of the doctors, while the other doctor near him just held his hands behind his back, a smile underneath his bushy mustache as he turned towards Inko. Izuku turned towards his mother, face tear-stained as one hand held onto the big hospital gown and sweater he wore, while the other held onto the coat of the doctor that was holding him. He really is alive, Inko thought as she ran over to Izuku, immediately pulling him away from the doctor and into her own tight embrace. He clung on to her too, but not nearly as tight as she was him. She ran her fingers through his hair when she had held him long enough that she knew this was real, that her boy really was alive, could be brought home. It seems his quirk manifested, the doctor who was holding Izuku started. It's the first of its kind, which is a pretty shocking thing to say, when 80% of the world has a quirk. A resurrection quirk, the other doctor said. This was the one that she was supposed to meet for Izuku's appointment a few days ago, Dr. Garaki. It seems that the appointment is no longer needed. We've already filed for it to be put into the quirk registry, and that should be fully processed soon. That was when the doctor who had been holding Izuku leaned closer to Inko, whispering, "I'd look out for your son, Mrs. Midoriya. He definitely remembers the crash, woke up screaming, and then wouldn't stop crying until he knew you were on the way." The doctor placed their hand on Inko's shoulder, giving it a small squeeze before walking back to Dr. Garaki. "We're not sure of the limits, but it seems that the few days he spent unconscious was his quirk building up energy for a mass healing through his body. Make sure he's in the best condition. It's willing to take him before bringing him back to life," Dr. Garaki explained. "He still has a few small cuts, but nothing that won't be fully healed by the end of the week." "Mama," Izuku started, trying to push his mother off finally. Squeezing too tight. Inko slightly loosened her hold, but wasn't fully prepared to let him go. She still kept a hand on his head, continuing to run her fingers through his hair. "No more broken bones. He's not bleeding anywhere anymore?" Inko questioned, finally looking up at the doctors. "All of those were fully healed by his quirk," Dr. Garaki confirmed. "And we've already checked on him as much as he needs to be. He's free to be taken home." Inko doesn't know when Mitsuki got there, but the blonde woman gently placed her hand on Inko's shoulder, talking to the doctors as she said, "Thank you. We'll be sure to make sure he stays safe. We don't exactly want to test the limits of that quirk anytime soon." Once they were back in the car, Inko didn't go back to the passenger seat. while always keeping some kind of hold on Izuku. She buckled him in the middle of the back seats in the car, and buckled herself up next to him. She had to make sure he would stay with her this time. Inko was given another chance, and she wasn't going to let something happen to him again, something that could take him away. Izuku had thought that his mother was strict with how often she was questioning him about where he was going before he got hit by that car. But now he couldn't go anywhere without her. He usually liked to be around her, and really wanted to stick so close to her after the first week with how scary it had been when the car swerved after seeing him in the road, inevitably just making it worse and crashing into Izuku. But his own friends were getting annoyed whenever his mother was there, starting to say that they were just going to go home. Katsuki was frustrated about it too, but he was actually visiting Izuku at his house, the one spot that his mom wasn't entirely hovering, and Izuku could actually get some time to himself. Though, it often felt like Katsuki was visiting, because Auntie Mitsuki was constantly coming over, usually with a bunch of snacks to share with the Midoriya household. Auntie Mitsuki was spending more time with Izuku, though, a huge contrast to his friends. And whenever she was over, if she wasn't around Izuku, she would have Katsuki hanging out with Izuku instead, while she went to talk to his mom. Today was a quiet day though. He had holed himself up in his room, holding the toy that he had been worried he would have lost to a car a few weeks ago. He was glad that All Might had made it, but he was frustrated with what happened to make sure it was okay. He did try to look at the plus side of the situation, like how he had a quirk. It wasn't something he could use to help him like Katsuki's, but he had a quirk. How it would come of use for him, he would figure that out later. He jumped off of his bed, walking over to his bookshelf and pulling out the notebook he had started his hero analysis notes on. Though, it was as he was about to sit at his desk that he heard a knock at the front door. Izuku quickly ran to the door, beating his mother to the front door since his room was closer than the kitchen, where she had been trying to prepare lunch for the both of them. The only visitors they ever really had were the Bakugos and detectives for a little while, who would talk to his mom about the accident and their progress in wrapping everything up. So Izuku was visibly surprised when it was people he didn't know at all at the door. There were 3 of them, and all of them were wearing a suit, though the woman at the front wore a skirt instead. None of them managed to get out a word before Izuku's mom was suddenly at the door, gently leading Izuku to stand behind her as she stood in the doorway, saying, hello. Is there anything I can help you with? Yes, Mrs. Midoriya. I'm the commission president, and these are 2 of my trusted bodyguards. I was wondering if I could come in, by any chance, the woman in the front asked. His mom seemed to ponder over it for a moment, clasping onto Izuku's hand as she said, What is it that you want to talk about? We were hoping to talk to you about your son, the woman answered. That seemed to frustrate Izuku's mom, as she said, I'm well aware that the commission is in charge of heroes, and if you're here to talk about him, this isn't a topic I'm willing to discuss. Please, Mrs. Midoriya, we just think that his quirk would work rather well in the heroics field, and we could help him learn. With a quirk with such a rarity, it would be a waste to not give him a chance in the heroics field, the commission president explained. My son's quirk is activated with him dying, because it brings him back from the dead. We have no clue what the limits are, but I won't be testing it out. Izuku won't be going into heroics just so he can put himself at risk. I won't allow it, his mother argued, her voice final, and she slams the door in the commission president's face. Izuku was told to not go answering the door after that, but he didn't plan to either. Not when he was too busy holding himself up in his room after hearing her basically say that she didn't want to allow him to be a hero. Eventually, Izuku was back in preschool, where he knew his mother couldn't be. There were plenty of fun things he had missed too. All of those projects he could have done with his classmates. But within all fairness to his mom, dying was a scary thing, and the month at home had been nice for the most part. And apparently, even in a world where there were so many unique powers, People didn't usually come back from the dead, so they were unsure how to handle Izuku's situation much anyway. He was in the middle of coloring with Katsuki when there was someone at the door. Their teacher had stepped out then after talking in a hushed tone to whoever was out there, before she eventually just stepped out entirely. Immediately, everyone broke out into their own conversations, wondering what was happening. It wasn't often that their teacher had to leave the room to talk to someone, so they were naturally all nosy. And then she came back, scanning the room for a moment before her eyes landed on Izuku. And she said, "You're needed out here, Midoriya." With a frown, Izuku put his crayons down and walked out the door, ignoring how the whispers only increased. He had learned in his very short time in school that anyone being called out of the classroom wasn't fun. In fact, it felt embarrassing when it was his turn to be called out of the room. Once he was out of the room, he looked up to see the commission president again, who gave him a smile of her own. Izuku was nervous to see her again after how his mother yelled at her. But he also knew that she came with a promise to help him be a hero, which had been his biggest dream. He had always thought he'd be a hero with his mom or dad's quirk, and was struggling to think about how his own quirk would benefit him. But the commission president had said that she'd figure it out. She could help him use his quirk. "Be a hero. Midoriya, it's a pleasure to see you again," she started. "If you don't mind, we would like for you to follow us. We're just going to talk for a bit, and then you'll be right back to your class." Izuku looked up at them, thinking it over for a minute, especially thinking about how his mom would react if she found out. He didn't want to tell her, though. Not when he remembered how protective she had been lately. "All right," he said, and the commission president held out her hand, and then led him to another classroom, this one empty. There were 2 different people with her this time, staying by her side. Once they were all seated, she pulled out some paper and crayons, saying, "I figured you may want something to do, because our conversation may take a while." "Thank you," Izuku said with a smile, happily accepting the drawing materials. The commission president and the 2 people that came with her sat just across from Izuku, at one of the group tables. She sat in the middle, just as Izuku did on his side of the table, where he started trying to draw something. It didn't take long for him to settle on wanting to draw All Might. "Now, Midoriya, do you have any idea why we may be talking to you? Because you want to help me use my quirk to be a hero, right?" He spared a glance up from the start of his drawing before quickly looking back down, scribbling away. "You're a very smart boy. Would you want the commission to help train you? Start getting you prepared for heroics earlier than your friends would be allowed." Izuku looked up at her with a smile before nodding vigorously, saying, "I think it's really cool that you want to help. My mom is way too protective over me, and it got even worse after I got hit. And I don't want to go against Mama, but it feels like she doesn't want to listen to what I want to do anymore." He stops drawing, instead frowning at the All Might picture. "She doesn't want to let me watch my favorite All Might video anymore, because it's too scary for her. But she's hardly ever in the room when I watch it." "Does she? What else has she been doing ever since your quirk developed?" Izuku thought about it, about the things she had been doing that had upset him. There were plenty of things that upset him. He turned back to his drawing, trying to draw himself next to All Might as he started with his list of things that had made him upset with his mother. How she refused to let him out of her sight. How his friends were wanting to be around him less and less because of her hovering. How it felt like she was just ignoring what he wanted to do. And he felt like she just barely let him go to school again. By the time he was done, and the commission president had listened the entire time with an occasional question, she said, "All right, we're done for today. We have what we need. Thank you, Midoriya. We hope to be able to talk to you again soon." And then Izuku was taken back to his classroom, without much of any time left in class. He had no clue just how much things would change after talking to the commission president after that. But he would find out soon enough. Inko could hardly believe the turn of events the past couple of weeks. The past month and a half was something she would hope was a dream, that none of it was real. She wished that she would wake up, and she and Izuku would go to that appointment, coming home finding out he was quirkless, or was just a little late to developing a quirk. If he had to have had a quirk, why couldn't it be something like hers? Hisashi's was a little destructive, but if he was here, he could have taught Izuku. Then it wouldn't have been much of a problem to Inko, and Izuku would still have a quirk. Her own quirk, though. It seemed like one of the easier options, something she could help Izuku with, and he'd have something that would make him happy. All he had wanted was a quirk, no matter how small, but the selfish part of Inko still wished her child just didn't have one. That way he wouldn't try to throw himself so hard into a dangerous world that she wanted to keep him from getting hurt in. She wished that damned crash never happened. None of this would have happened if that car didn't swerve in the direction that Izuku was in. If they had just turned their wheel the other way, Izuku would have been fine. Spooked. But fine. Inko was a woman who tried to not hold much resentment towards people. But that driver was someone she would never forgive. But she had more people that could very easily be added to that list today. With a sigh, she tossed another dress into the corner of the room she was once more staying in. It was a little frustrating that she only had gotten to stay out of the room that the Bakugos had lent her for a few weeks. She was back to being under their care, and Inko kept trying to think of ways to make it up to them. They never let her do much in that department, but they were happy to let her cook alongside them and help with some of the chores. "What's wrong with that dress?" Mitsuki asked from her spot on the bed. "I'm worried it doesn't make me look good in terms of being a mother," Inko mutters, digging through the other dresses that Mitsuki had brought in for her. None of Inko's dresses had exactly seemed fitting for a court setting, but Mitsuki had come in with a box full of outfits that could work. "Inko dear, we're up against the commission. I'm not trying to be a pessimist here, but there's not much of a chance that having a good outfit is going to change much of what's going to happen," Mitsuki retorted. Inko frowned at the box as she dug through it, but not for the fact that she was struggled to find an outfit. No, it was her friend's reminder that this was the commission. The commission, who had been making things difficult for her ever since they first came to her door. Mitsuki let out a sudden groan, flopping against the bed as she let out her frustrations. Just who do they think they are, though? All those shitheads think that they can take custody of a 4-year-old without a single person actually set to take care of Izuku. And they're trying to bring your capabilities as a mother up to the question. Anyone with a fucking brain can tell you're a great mother. As Mitsuki finished her yelling, she was quick to get up again, making her way over to Inko, digging through the box with her. Eventually, she pulled out a simple button-up shirt, a dark coat, and a matching skirt. "You'll probably blend in a bit if you wear this," Mitsuki suggests. Inko wipes at the tears welling up in her eyes before she nods, gently taking the clothes from her friend. And then Mitsuki was back on her venting tangent, though quieter this time, saying, "They're spewing bullshit about how they had enough from statements with Izuku to take him away from you. But all they've done now is leave Izuku with the damn police. And now we've had police going back and forth for our statements, and the commission coming up to the door to offer you some stupid fucking deals. But none of them end with you with Izuku, and they're stupid as hell if they think that you're not getting your kid. The commission wants to spew all their self-righteous nonsense, but they're just going to steal a kid away from an innocent mother. Izuku is 4. He's easy to convince, and all they have to do is dangle being a hero over Izuku's head like a shiny new All Might toy, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it. They're keeping their entire argument based on what a 4-year-old says. There's no way it'll carry, not when you haven't actually done anything wrong. You've just been a worried mother." "Inko, I'm not sure what I would have done differently in your shoes. Probably made sure that the school wouldn't let anyone in to talk to Katsuki behind your back," Inko sniffled, ready to bury her face in the clean outfit she needed to get changed into. Well, there was also the hope that they knew how to listen to no, Mitsuki said, gently grabbing her friend's hands. And it was his first day back. None of us could have predicted that they'd take the chance the second it was open to them. I didn't even realize his school wouldn't even be a safe place for him to be, Inko cried. What would they want with a 4-year-old boy anyway? The only thing his quirk does is keep him from dying. And what good will that do him in a fight, except for letting himself be more prone to accidents? I can see how a hero who wouldn't die would benefit them. But why not wait until he's older and had the quirk longer? Mitsuki questions. There's something really suspicious about this, other than this whole stupid fucking custody battle we have today. Inko moves the outfit she was given to one arm, using the other to wipe the tears off of her face, sniffling as she gets up. Mitsuki takes this as her cue to leave the room for a minute, saying, I'll go and look for some jewelry in my room while you get changed. I'll be back in a couple minutes. Once the door clicked shut again, Inko didn't spare much time to stare at the clothes in despair even longer, quickly changing from her sweater and sweatpants into the outfit she'd be wearing to court today, zipping up the skirt and shakily working through all the buttons. She had to get this done today, and all she could hope was that she could bring Izuku home. The car ride was excruciating. Inko thought that the ride to the hospital when she was told Izuku was alive was bad, or the one to the hospital when the incident happened. But this one felt so much worse. This wasn't just a short matter where things would be officially said and done. Things would of course be said, and things would be official. But not in the same manner as, he's dead, and, see, he really is alive. No, it would be something that she genuinely felt like she could have done so much more to change. When was heroics so much more important than family? Mitsuki seemed all too aware that Inko's thoughts were spiraling as she said, Listen, I really think that they can't pile enough proof against you today. I'm sure that by the end of today, Izuku will happily be coming over to my house tonight. You and him both. And we're going to have a great dinner. And the boys will be playing until they knock themselves out, because they're so tired after all the fun they had. You're a good parent, Inko. Inko knew she had done her best as a parent, that she had done everything she could. But she had such a bad feeling about how today was going to go. Being against the people who were basically the government these days made it all the more worrisome for her, especially at the thought that they would find some way to trick people, or pay them off to prove that she was a bad mother. It did make her wonder what Izuku said, however, that had the police picking him up from her home, keeping him with them while this whole thing went under investigation. Naomasa was still relatively new to detective work in comparison to the others that he was working with lately, and sometimes felt like he couldn't trust his gut instinct as well as the others did. But his gut told him there was something wrong with this case. His co-workers, on the other hand, insisted that everything was okay. And then they would act like he didn't notice random groups of them walking off to whisper about something, or how often he was sent off to look after the boy currently under their car, up until the commission, in their words, inevitably takes the boy, and then that whole building gets to look after him. At the thought of the little Midoriya, Naomasa turned his chair to face the boy, who was messing with a puzzle that the commission had gifted him just the other day. He had ignored it for a while in favor of the hero coloring book he had been given the day before that, but now was putting all of his little 4-year-old attention onto the puzzle. It was some kind of ball with a smaller ball inside that would have to be wound along a maze, keeping it on the path and making an attempt to get to the end. Izuku moved the ball carefully in his little hands, eyes wide and watching the smaller ball closely as he tried to keep it on the difficult path. And then there was a soft clatter against the plastic that held it, and Izuku let out a long sigh, setting the ball down at his annoyance. Couldn't figure it out, kid, Naomasa asked with a smile. I know what I need to do, but I can't figure out how to do it. It's a weird gap part that drops onto another. The drop is hard, Izuku answers. It needs to drop just the right way. What level of it did you get to on that path? Naomasa asks, leaning forward, placing his elbows on his knees as he laced his fingers together. He was genuinely interested in the kid's train of thought, what all he had been up to these past couple of weeks while under his care. Izuku had alternated between plenty of different things, most of them gifts from the commission to occupy his time. 20, Izuku replies, frowning at the ball. I'd say that's pretty good for a kid your age. I want to do better, though. If I want to be a hero, I have to be better at all of these things. I can't just keep failing. Izuku grabs the ball again, turning it over in his little hands until the smaller ball reaches the starting point of the path he was trying to complete. Naomasa slid off of his chair, scooching to sit next to Izuku on the floor. He had paperwork he needed to continue to look through, but that could wait until later. Today was a big day for Izuku, and it was something that Naomasa needed to make sure that the boy was ready for. Though, they still had an hour before Naomasa needed to get Izuku out of the door, where he would drive the boy to court, and they would be waiting in a room together while the trial went on. In whatever direction the trial went, Naomasa would be handing Izuku to whoever was deemed the better caretaker for Izuku. Naomasa internally hoped that it was Izuku's mother. He seemed to be the only one amongst his team to share that sentiment. The detective ruffled the boy's hair and then asked, I know you've probably been asked this a lot, but what are you hoping for after today? To help be taught how to be as great of a hero as All Might, Izuku quickly answers, eyes intently watching the smaller ball as he carefully rotates the plastic that keeps it trapped. But why not wait until you're older, so you can make sure you have time with your mom? You do realize that being with the commission means you can't be with your mom anymore, right? It was already far too late to be asking questions like these, because nothing he or Izuku said right now would change the trial happening. Not with it so close, with all of the investigation Naomasa's team had supposedly been doing. Why was Naomasa the only one taking care of Izuku most of the time anyway? He at first thought it was just because he had the least experience, and was more focused on criminal than domestic cases. But it was a little suspicious that he wasn't being brought out to help them at all. Naomasa was aware that the kid had a resurrection quirk. But what made him so special that the commission, and anyone they went to, were keen on pulling Izuku Midoriya away from his mother? Because Mama doesn't want to let me be a hero anymore, and she knows it's my dream, Izuku answers. That would answer why he wasn't so upset with the idea of the commission taking him in, but not why everyone else was so willing for Izuku to be taken away from his mom. Naomasa wasn't going to pry much further, worried that he would upset Izuku. Though he did continue to keep a close eye on him, a little closer than he had been. And then the time had arrived. The trial that would determine how things would go. All while Naomasa and Izuku hid away in another room, while waiting for it to finish. Do you have everything you need to keep you entertained for probably a few hours? Naomasa double-checked with Izuku, to which the boy nodded, his arms already full with the ball puzzle from earlier, a crayon box, a hero coloring book, an All Might toy that he had hardly let go of ever since he was brought to the office, and a couple small books. Naomasa wondered if those would really be enough, knowing that children often bounced from wanting to do one thing to the next. It furthered his questioning on why the court would probably be using Izuku's own words against his mother, while being too young to even be in the courtroom himself. Of course, things would be looked into if any child were to say that their parent had hurt them, or that they weren't being taken care of as well as they should be. But from everything Naomasa had heard from people close to Mrs. Midoriya, she hadn't actually done anything to harm her child in any way. The closest thing Naomasa could conclude to that would be shutting down the dreams of a 4-year-old, though, the line of reasoning for what Izuku had been hoping for, and the recent events that had led to Inko shutting down those hopes, should be considered reasonable. If Naomasa's sister had gotten a quirk like Izuku's, and had discovered the quirk as the boy had, Naomasa isn't too sure how differently he would react, and that was for his sister. Though he may have tried to give the message a little differently, He could understand that it was a little difficult to stay entirely calm when dealing with the commission. And that's just from hearing about how they often act from the heroes. Naomasa can only imagine what it was like for a mother, just trying to look out for her child. The detective sighed, and then double-checked everything in the back of the car, making sure Izuku was fully situated and safe in the back. This involved him checking over the car seat multiple times, hoping it really was secure. He really didn't want anything to happen to the boy while he was under Naomasa's care. "All right," Naomasa said under his breath, sighing and triple-checking the car seat before finally making his way to the driver's seat. Getting himself situated was a much faster process, and it didn't take long after that to finally get going. "Are you nervous?" Naomasa asked, glancing in the rear-view mirror to see if he could catch any reaction from Izuku, see how the boy was feeling. What he saw in that moment was Izuku holding onto his toy just a little tighter, and how his face scrunched up. "Kinda," Izuku muttered. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really." Izuku had been doing a lot of talking lately, telling a bunch of people he didn't know how he felt about things that he didn't fully understand. But Izuku was a 4-year-old who had already died once, came back, and had apparently watched as his friends wanted to be around him less and less, while his mother clung onto him tighter. And now he's been pulled away from his home because of the commission taking an interest in the boy's potential, and apparently uncovering just how poorly Inko had been handling her son ever since his quirk development. The ride stayed silent for a long while, up until Izuku said something, just barely loud enough for the detective to hear. "Do you think Mama is going to be mad at me?" Naomasa had yet to meet the woman on his own, never getting to be the detective to talk to her. But he had listened to the questionings, read through every bit of paperwork he could get his hands on for this case, and listen to Izuku talk about his mother intently. He wasn't entirely sure, but he could at least say with some confidence, "I don't think she's mad. I think she's worried about you, but she won't be mad at you for any of this. She's always worried, though. That's just something parents do a lot. I worry for my little sister too," Naomasa replied, glancing up to the rearview mirror again, this time giving the frowning boy a small smile. "It's just something that comes with caring for people. Why do you think your mom would be mad at you for this?" Izuku didn't speak up after that, but Naomasa heard him move a bit, probably just giving a small shrug as he returned to silence. Nothing had gone well in there. Inko and Mitsuki had walked in thinking there was no way that they could have anything that could actually be used against her, that the only thing they had was the word of a 4-year-old, which was something Mitsuki could easily explain if they didn't want to hear Inko. Seeing one of the doctors who gave her Izuku up there, going against Inko, she would have broken down if it wasn't for the fact that she had been so carefully trying to hold herself together to the point she could barely process what was going on around her anymore. It wasn't until everything was being put to a decision, and everyone would be returning once the decision was made, that Inko was suddenly pulled out of her head as Mitsuki lightly shook her. Mitsuki had held herself together well, though Inko could tell that there were multiple periods of time that Mitsuki was just about ready to lunge out of her seat and start screaming at whoever had spoken. She probably would have if it weren't for the fact that it would ruin the chances of Izuku coming home. So the two of them sat on a bench inside, Inko fiddling with her skirt while Mitsuki angrily sat in the seat, arms crossed as one of her feet impatiently tapped against the hard wood beneath them. "They must have been paying people off, because what the hell was that?" Mitsuki hissed, her voice much quieter than the sound of her shoe angrily tapping against the floor. "I was at the hospital when you picked Izuku up, and you weren't intentionally trying to hurt him." "I don't get why they would try to make it sound like that." "They didn't say that I was trying to hurt him," Inko said, her reply a whisper. "No, but they implied it. Enough that they would have needed to specify that you weren't actually trying to hurt him. And that's one of the dangers there." Mitsuki paused for a moment, the tapping of her foot slowly coming to a stop. She then gently placed one of her hands on Inko and said, I think this whole trial has been rigged. The commission really doesn't want there to be any chance of Izuku coming home. I just think they wanted to let you pretend like you had a chance up until now. Inks. Inko quickly looked away from her friend, trying to keep herself from crying. She had to keep herself presentable, and she couldn't go back in with her makeup ruined. After, though, she knew her makeup would be a disaster before they even got far. Inko was trying to be at least a little hopeful. She hoped that the people who were trusted with heroes, whose one job was to keep the people safe, would at least have some heart, and wouldn't pull out such cruel measures just to make sure they could keep her child. She didn't want to think that they would go around, using the extensive amount of money they had to buy people into their favor. All for a little boy who probably couldn't die. Her little boy. Mitsuki never brought up any of her hopes to have both of their boys home and playing together after that. Neither of them brought up the boys. They just stayed quiet, waiting and hoping. Inko hoped that Mitsuki was hoping, at least. She hoped her friend hadn't just already accepted that Izuku wouldn't be coming home, because there had to be someone who wasn't entirely siding with the commission in there. Inko had done her best to be a good mom, and she knew that. Clenching her fingers tightly into the skirt, she whispered, "I've been a good mother, and there's no way they could take care of Izuku better than I have." By the end, it was a loss. The tears Mitsuki had been waiting for and expecting never arrived from Inko, as her best friend's face went blank. It stayed blank as Mitsuki led her every step out of the building. It was like Inko just wasn't present anymore. Nothing she could really do for herself after the verdict was passed. Izuku wasn't coming home, and there was nothing they could do about it. The commission would be taking Izuku far away from them, and both mothers would be going home to explain to Masaru and Katsuki that they lost. Oh, and her poor Katsuki too. He'd be beyond mad about the situation. But Mitsuki knew that he would try to help Inko in his own little Katsuki way. She wasn't sure how much she could trust that. Masaru, on the other hand, always seemed to know what to do to help Inko. That fact had always been something that made Mitsuki jealous of her husband. But when she saw the similarities in the two, she just came to accept that she was best at keeping her best friend happy when she was already happy, and could cheer Inko up even more after Masaru had helped take care of the bigger part of the issue. Mitsuki needed Masaru's help for sure this time. She had no clue what to do when her friend looked so lifeless. She felt like Inko just barely managed to buckle her own seatbelt and get back in the car. Mitsuki herself felt like she shouldn't be driving, but didn't want to leave her car here to just come back tomorrow, when she would feel a bit better about this whole situation. With a deep sigh, she made her way back home, keeping one hand on her friend the entirety of the drive. She made no attempt at conversation, feeling like she would be the only one saying anything, and that Inko would continue her blank look out the window. Once home, it didn't take long for Masaru to run out the door, Katsuki not far behind. The boys waited patiently on the porch for Mitsuki to park, but the second the car was off, they continued their run. Katsuki basically rammed into the car, his fingers clinging to the metal just beneath the window as he jumped up and down, looking for any sign of Izuku. Mitsuki watched as Inko slowly got out of the car, waiting until Inko was out before she even opened her own door. Masaru gently reached out to hold Mitsuki's arm as she got out, but she couldn't face her husband. She just shook her head, and then held her hand out to Inko, who loosely held onto the outstretched hand. "Where's Izuku?" Katsuki asked, swinging open the door he had been trying to see through, and trying to answer his own question. Masaru briefly let go of Mitsuki as he walked over to Katsuki, holding their son in one arm as he shut the doors with his free hand. He was the one who answered, giving their son a sad look as he said, "I'm afraid Izuku isn't coming home. His quirk isn't saving taking him home this time." Katsuki's mouth gaped, and his voice very quickly cut the quiet tones that everyone had been keeping for the past while, as he shouted, "But that's not fair. He should be home. This is so stupid." I know, kiddo, I know, Masaru said as he pulled Katsuki into a hug. The boy protested against it, squirming, and his hands setting off little sparks. Mitsuki continued to walk Inko inside, where she smelt the dinner Masaru had been presumably cooking on their way here. She led Inko to the living room, knowing that wherever she left Inko at, that's where she was going to be finding Inko for the next while. This had happened when Izuku had died. It's just, Inko wasn't so quiet that time. She really wished her friend would at least cry. It made her beyond worried to see her friend so still and silent. Inko stayed like that for weeks, and the only reason she had gone anywhere was by Mitsuki and Masaru's lead. Katsuki seemed unsure of how to respond to her stillness, often just staring at her before he would shut himself in his own room. Mitsuki and Masaru were both having a hard time trying to figure out how Katsuki felt about the situation, what he was thinking. Every time they made an attempt, he would just get snappy and try to push them out of his room. He would come to them when he was ready. That was what Mitsuki and Masaru told each other, trying to spend their time getting Inko off the couch on her own instead. They would just have to hope they were handling the situation well. Izuku was just finishing up yet another page in his hero coloring book when the commission president came into the room he and Tsukachi had been waiting in. She had come in with a smile, her fingers delicately laced together as she crouched down, sitting next to him. I get to go with you to be a hero, Izuku asks, his eyes wide as he stares up at the woman. MHM, she replies, ruffling his hair as her eyes turn towards his drawings. Is that what you've been doing the whole time? Just drawing? Izuku quickly shakes his head, reaching to grab the ball that he'd been slowly getting further and further on, and says, I've been working on this too. And reading. I read more than I thought. It took a while. Well, things like this often do, she explains. Now, are you ready to go to the building you'll be staying at with me, Midoriya? Izuku nods, a smile lighting up on his face. The commission president holds out her hand, and Izuku excitedly grabs it, and she starts to lead him out of the building. But then he stops, turning back to the room as he says, I need to get my stuff. We'll be sure to get it for you, she says, turning to one of the people in suits who were following them, nodding her head in a gesture for him to grab them. He gives his own nod, this one in acknowledgement, before he turned to walk in the direction that Izuku and the commission president were just walking off. Tsukachi had helped pick the things up too, but the commission president didn't let them stand there long, as she continued to walk herself and Izuku out of the building. As Izuku was getting buckled up, a car seat already in the car, he asked, I'll be able to see Mama eventually, right? The commission president was quick with her response as she got into the car from the other side, sitting next to Izuku and buckling herself up since there was already someone in the driver's seat. No, I'm afraid not. But you said that I'd be able to see her. Just that I couldn't stay with her anymore if you were going to help train me, Izuku said with a frown. I had said probably, sweet boy. It's just, there was more than we thought, and it just wasn't safe to let her even see you, she had said with a reassuring smile, reaching to cup Izuku's face in her hands, trying to comfort him. It's just the safest option we have. But there's another boy that you can meet, someone else we've also been able to take in. You'll be trained with him, all right? Izuku still couldn't help but let the tears in his eyes fall, trying to wipe them away before they could get on the commission president. Rude awakenings were far from a foreign concept to Izuku, but they never stopped being annoying, a horrible start to his day, leading to an even worse finish. He had learned over the 10 years he had spent in the commission building that if he was being woken up, it wasn't for anything fun. Midoriya, time to start training, one of the commission members, Goshika, said. He'd basically been in charge of Izuku's schedule for the longest time, and was a beyond familiar face. Familiar enough that Izuku was willing to throw some snark the man's way for his own peace. 10 more minutes, or I'm gonna run off, Izuku mutters, burying his head deeper into one pillow as he grabs the other, throwing it in the general direction that he heard Gushika's voice in. You say the same thing at least once a week, Gushika drawls. Izuku finally glances up from his pillows, looking at the tired man, holding the tossed pillow in one hand. Now come on, you need to get started on your training today. There's another test this afternoon, so you need to get your practice done early. Izuku let out a deep sigh into his pillow, pushing himself up and holding out his hand for the other pillow to be returned to him. It didn't take long for it to be there, and he quickly tucked it to where it was supposed to be on the bed. Gushika finally left as Izuku heaved himself off of the bed, giving him the space he needed to get dressed. Izuku decided to just settle with sweatpants and a t-shirt today, something simple that he was already expecting to need to change later, after he had already brought himself to a sweaty mess. As soon as he opened the door, Gushika was already waiting there, gently placing his hand on Izuku's shoulder as they walked down the familiar halls. Izuku rubbed tiredly at his eyes, ignoring the aching in his stomach as he thought about the food he was ready to eat. Gushika hadn't specifically mentioned food, but Izuku knew that he'd be getting some before training. Tired? Gushika questions, eyebrow raised as he watches Izuku rub at his eyes, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. You've already gotten a few days of sleep after the last test, and you've gotten a couple days of a break since then. You would think you'd be well rested by now? Hey, you know by now that rest doesn't count, Izuku says, giving the man who usually takes care of him a small glare before starting to walk ahead, fists balled up at his sides. Izuku winded down the hallways, taking the stairs he needed to, ignoring most who walked past him, as they had all grown used to just minding their business, ignoring what anyone else was doing. They had their work to do, and Izuku often had some training to get to whenever he was actually out of his room. Gushika kept somewhat close, but he still kept the distance that Izuku had established. They both knew that Izuku would go where he needed to, and was well aware of the path that he needed to take. Most of the days he was awake were spent training anyway, often changing through different kinds of training, mainly alternating between training with weapons and without. Lately, though, the past few months have been spent trying to integrate the two kinds of training, try to make a fighting style out of them. That was the kind of training he had come here for. Something he often wished could have been remembered by the commission president. As soon as Izuku got to the training room, Gushika caught up and led Izuku to the corner of the room, where a container with his breakfast was waiting. He sat himself down on the ground, where the mats on the floor didn't reach, and began to enjoy the still warm omelet that had been prepared. It was only about 15 minutes later that Izuku's trainer of the day walked in, the staff that he had been favoring lately already in her hand, softly twirling between her fingers as she waited. Once Izuku finished with his breakfast, Gushika took the empty container and walked off with it, leaving Izuku with his trainer. All right, go ahead and get your stretches done, and then we'll start. I'm assuming that was enough food to get you started for the day, she began to ask, already beginning her own stretching routine. Yeah, it was fine, Izuku answered, imitating what she was doing. It was about an hour in that they had switched to no weapons, and Izuku was very quickly reminded about how he had to make sure his own attacks didn't go against him, as his attempt to push the woman down from putting his weight on her shoulders had him twirled off and slammed onto the mat beneath them. She still had her own staff, though, and used it to hold Izuku to the ground, much to his own frustration. But he had at least learned how to get himself out of this situation, and to be grateful that it was a staff, and not something like a sword. Much to his own joy, it was his turn to knock the woman down, smiling in satisfaction as she fell, the shock on her face obvious. Her staff slipped out of her hand in her fall, and Izuku quickly pinned the empty hands behind her back, securing his victory. But his lesson had been learned a few years ago, that he wasn't to let go until the trainer themselves declared that he had won. With a deep sigh of her own, his trainer agreed that he had won, and he was quick to let go of her, taking a few steps back as he watched her get up. All right. I'll let them know I'm done with you for the day. I'm sure someone will be here soon for more hand-to-hand training though, she says, brushing herself off as she walks over to her water bottle, which she had left in her corner of the room. Sure enough, Izuku's next trainer of the day didn't wait long to walk in, presumably already having gotten ready for this already, as he gestured for Izuku to come back to the mat to practice. If Izuku frowned, well, it was only fair. He really wanted to get some of his own water. Was the plan to dehydrate him to death now? He sure hoped not. Man, Izuku really couldn't stand this trainer most of the time. Come on now, cutting you in half didn't kill you, so I'm sure that you won't die from some simple training. The man training Izuku taunted, already getting into position for the next round of their fight. You're getting good too, even with that downtime. You're getting close to knocking me down. And wouldn't that be quite the feat? This guy had managed to stick around as someone to train Izuku for the longest, most eventually running out of things to teach him as he mastered them all. But this guy was difficult to beat, being pure muscle, and always having this solid kind of stance that Izuku could never perfect himself. It was like trying to knock down a solid wall. Izuku was really hoping to start consistently winning soon. That way he could just move on from this guy. But it was taking a lot of what he learned from everyone else to win at most once, whenever this guy was in charge of Izuku's training. And eventually, the methods Izuku tried would be caught on to, and was very easily avoided the next time. Most villains aren't repetitive though, Izuku frustratingly thought to himself. It's typically one fight and done, so they wouldn't catch on to stuff like this, especially if I go underground. Izuku knew that most heroes trained by the Commission were expected to go into spotlight heroics. But Izuku was also well aware that they usually had flashy quirks. Lady Nagant and Hawks had been prime examples of people with powerful, flashy quirks. Izuku's was powerful, but not something flashy that could easily take down villains given the opportunity. No, Izuku's fighting solely relied on a lot of quirkless fighting, with a backup measure in the event that he didn't win the fight. But if he died, then that meant the villain got away. Izuku just got to make sure that he was constantly able to go after the villain, and knew what he was getting himself into better for next time. But in the meantime, his learning involved trying to be able to take down this trainer multiple times in a row, and the span of time it took for him to come back from certain death. With some of the Commission President's discussions lately, it seemed the next idea was to see how long it would take for his body to come back when a lot more damage was done to it. Something like cremation. It was, admittedly, a horrifying idea. But he would already be dead before being burnt for the test. See how long it took to come back. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Then again, he was unsure of how much damage his body could take before it quit. And they had learned over the years that if he has more energy, he can come back a little bit quicker, make things a bit easier. That was why it was pretty important to get as much rest as he could, and why he had spent the past couple days sleeping in. Wasting all of that energy on training seemed like a waste, and he would much rather catch up on some more sleep. Maybe he could take a nap after a shower. Try to get some of the rest he lost back. With a long sigh, Izuku walked back over to Luz again, already having tested out something new for a brief moment of victory. Of course, Izuku had very quickly been thrown off, and it was soon marked as another loss on Izuku's part. 2 years, and you still can't get rid of me, huh, kid? The trainer taunted, smiling as if he sensed the thoughts of frustration circling around in Izuku's head. How many more people need to teach you something new before you can actually win? It's not my fault that there's a no weapons allowed rule against you, Izuku complained, frowning at the man. If I could bring a staff in, I'm sure I could do better. And if your opponent knocks your weapon out, Midoriya, whether you believe it or not, you're going to be up against tough opponents, no matter what path of heroics you take. If you can't win against me, how are you going to do better than any other hero? The Commission is having you train to be better, the trainer reminded. With how much they talked, Izuku really was wishing that he knew his name. 2 years, and the man still avoided sharing his name like the plague, talking about how it wasn't important when the only thing they were supposed to be doing was training. In frustration, Izuku started the next round of their fighting, lashing out with a punch first, quickly finding it unable to hit as the trainer grabbed Izuku's arm, quickly pulling Izuku up into the air. Izuku made an attempt to make the man put him down by kicking at him, but they weren't doing much when they were more childish kicks than anything. Kiddo, walking into a fight angry makes you predictable. You're better at this when you actually try to put some thought into what you're doing, the man started. I know, Izuku shouted, kicking at him again. He was just given a pathetic frown in return, the man's arms stretching out to keep Izuku a little bit further away, making the kicks even weaker. There were already quite a few ways out of this, and you know it, the man continued. If you really want to prove that I made you upset, you'd actually try to win, right? Izuku kicked at him again. If your fighting skills get this bad when you're frustrated, maybe we should work on getting you some anger management classes so that you can figure out how to use your anger to make you a better fighter. I could bring it up with the commission president. And then the flailing stopped, and Izuku looked away as he mumbled "You don't need to tell her anything," before quickly swinging himself up to latch onto the man's arm, holding on with his legs so that he could somewhat painfully free his arm. All right, ready to get back to training? With a nod from Izuku, he was quickly slammed back onto the mat. Well, he was basically asking for that loss there. Izuku was exhausted on the ground by the time the door opened again, and Izuku's current least favorite trainer for the moment gave a small nod in acknowledgement before he stepped back. Izuku turned his head to see who had walked in, face lighting up the moment he saw the bright red feathers, eyes following them to see Keigo walking in with a small bag in hand. A smile held on the hero's face as well. Keigo, Izuku called, sitting up as quickly as his tired body would let him. Hey, there you are, Keigo greeted. Come on, I've got your lunch. Finally have some downtime, so I figured I could bring you something as a treat. Whatever gets me a nap sooner, Izuku said as he scrambled off of the floor, running up to Keigo and immediately opening the bag more to see what Keigo got. Sure enough, it was a bunch of chicken. He didn't often share his favorite food with people, but Izuku was often the exception, which he didn't hesitate to brag about whenever a commission member would walk into whatever room Keigo and Izuku were in. And they longingly looked at the warm food that Keigo had brought in. They could go get their own. This was Izuku's and Keigo's treat, provided by Keigo. Hey, no digging in the bag yet, Keigo says with a smile, moving the bag out of Izuku's reach. We're not eating in the training room. Not my fault you love to get greasy chicken, Izuku retorted, reaching for the bag. If Keigo being an adult already wasn't a factor to his height that made his attempts to get the food frustrating, it was even more so annoying that Izuku was already short for his age. Curse tall people. This is a very unfair game. It's not actually that greasy, Keigo argues, playfully frowning as he turns his head away, using a feather to bring the bag into the air and out of both of their grasps. But eat enough, and your hands will be. And I'm sure you don't want slipping on the mat to be a reason you lose next time. Izuku returned the frown, but quickly ran out of the room, standing in the doorway as he waited for Keigo to follow. The winged hero eyed the room for a second before turning to walk out himself, one of his feathers still holding the bag up in the air. It had to lower itself to get through the doorway, but it continued to follow the both of them as they made their way out of the training rooms. Definitely don't miss being down here all the time, Keigo says for the nth time. Every time he had the chance to come grab Izuku with lunch in hand, it was almost like he had to comment about how his training was over. At this point, Izuku would like to be sent out on missions, being 14 or not. He could even be sent into Spotlight Heroics if it meant he was out of training. At this rate, he was going to have more training sessions that Keigo had villains to take down. And that was with Keigo noticing most villains faster than others with his vantage point in the sky. Fighting villains meant that you got out of training, since that meant you were strong enough to not need training. And Keigo managed to get out of training so quickly, jumping into the world of heroics the moment he became an adult. And Izuku still had 4 more years to go at least, until he could fully jump out of training. Maybe he could have gotten out of it sooner, if he had as powerful of a quirk as Keigo did, and something that didn't need as much testing as Keigo's. It was almost as if Keigo could tell that Izuku was thinking of the experiments when he asked, "What do you think they're going to try next with your quirk?" "Probably going to see how much of my body they can get rid of, and see how long it takes to come back from that. I think I heard someone talking about cremating my body. I don't know. Sounds horrifying. But as long as I'm not awake," Izuku replied. Keigo frowned at the thought of it, his own wings twitching as he thought of the tests done on the limits of his quirk. Shuddering as he said, "I hate fire. I remember when they burned my feathers to see how long it took for them all to grow back." "Didn't they have you focus on a lot of physical training in that time, because of how long it took for the feathers to come back?" Izuku questioned, trying to recall the moment right. He had definitely been in the commission at that period of time for Keigo's training. It had just been a while since that test had happened. "Yeah, I wasn't at my best though, because my back hurt for a while. All the feathers were off when they were burnt, but I was so sore trying to grow them back," Keigo replied. His wings twitched, and the feathers seemed to get more compact, closer as if that was how they were going to protect themselves from the fire that wasn't coming. "And I feel all the stuff that happens to my feathers, and fire hurts." "Got it. Just have to hope that they give me some easier way to die first before I get burnt." "Man, that means I won't be able to see you for a long while," Keigo starts to complain, letting out a long sigh before saying, "I just barely managed to catch you this time too. I tried to pay a visit a few days ago, but they said that you were still dead, working on waking up." "What was that last one anyway?" "They didn't say what they were doing that time, and I couldn't catch you beforehand to ask." "Ooh, you remember when they cut me in half to see if I would grow a new torso up, or new legs a few weeks ago?" Izuku started to ask, trying to jog Keigo's memory. The blonde thought about it for a moment, tapping his chin in thought before pointing at Izuku and exclaiming, "Right. You didn't do either, and you just kinda snapped back together a week later. Caught one of the doctors off guard when your legs suddenly went flying." "Right, yeah. Anyway, they tried it again, but this time a vertical cut. My body still just flew right back to itself. It was a little bit faster this time though, which was nice. So I guess being cut in half vertically makes it a little faster. I don't know, it's weird. I still think it would have been funny for there to be either 2 existing Izuku heads or 4 legs," Keigo says, chuckling to himself before he asks, "Have you been writing things down in your notebook as you guys realize them?" "Mei-chan, the notebook is almost full though. The list of ways to die and how quickly I come back, plus the updates on those times to see if my quirk is getting any better, was definitely not a notebook I expected to be filled quite as quickly, nor to get much more than a few pages at all. I thought it would have just been a few pages by the time I was an adult," Izuku said with a long sigh of his own, shoulders slumping as he started walking up the first flight of stairs to get back to his room. Keigo didn't have one here anymore once he pulled together enough money to get an apartment of his own, and already hardly came around once he had his agency. So it was Izuku's room that they would generally hang out in, since most other rooms weren't exactly meant for people to just lounge around in, and most people were at work in them. Besides, the commission loved to keep a close eye on Izuku and Keigo, so there was no way that Keigo could take Izuku somewhere out of the building just yet, when not even Keigo was really allowed to leave until he had his hero license and started getting his training against real villains. If there was training, that was the kind of training Izuku would look forward to. Having a hero training license issued by the commission, while under the commission's care, meant that they could easily get training with work studies and internships right with the top 10 heroes. And if anything, the commission would rather them work under the top 10 heroes for their practice whenever they were finally getting to go against real villains rather than their trainers. Just under a couple years. And then it would finally be his turn to go and work alongside the top 10. Keigo was already in the top 10 ranking too, so Izuku could just stick with familiarity and work alongside Keigo. If he did that, then he wouldn't have to worry about explaining his creepy quirk to anyone who hadn't already heard about it and wasn't already used to it. Izuku's quirk was just something that Keigo and Izuku could have a casual conversation over. Izuku had learned that most people were rather uncomfortable with the idea of him dying often, and then coming back from the dead whenever he would get a new trainer, and would try to talk to them whenever they had given him a break. Well, the commission is picky with their learning. At least they try to make sure your deaths are quick most of the time, and try to make sure you're already dead for most of the ones that take a longer amount of time to kill. Keigo tried to reason with a shrug of his own. Other than that time, they let me die of some kind of sickness. They brought a villain out of jail to test that, Izuku exclaimed, throwing his hands into the air in frustration, eyebrows furrowed as he recalled that death a few years ago. A few minutes later, the two of them finally reached Izuku's room, and they both started digging into the chicken, the bucket quickly finding itself losing chicken and holding the bones that remained from Keigo's favorite food. It wasn't Izuku's, but it was still really nice to have, since it usually meant that he and Keigo were spending time together. Today, Keigo was talking about some of the missions he had been on the past few weeks, keeping the commission-specific ones out of it, as he talked about the villains he had taken down. It was with one of Izuku's many other notebooks that Izuku took notes on the villains that Keigo remembered, and used another for the heroes that Keigo worked with. Izuku really wanted to get out of the commission building for at least a day, so that he could go get notes on more heroes, see them in person. Oh, and then the villain yesterday afternoon didn't show much of any quirk at all, Keigo explained between his next bite of chicken. Izuku holding a chicken leg of his own in his left hand, while he quickly wrote down what Keigo was saying with his right. Or they just, never got the time to show it off before I took them down. The palm of their hand did start glowing when one of the other heroes were trying to stop them, before I flew in. Do you think it was some kind of emitter quirk? Izuku questions before he finally takes a bite of the chicken in his hand. Maybe. Might have actually been strong too, because they were insisting on the whole flight to the station that they would have been able to win if I got closer. Stopped keeping distance with my feathers, Keigo explained. Probably short-range then, if they weren't trying to get you on the flight. Seems right. After a few more minutes, and another very short description of Keigo's last fight, Izuku put the pencil down between his notebook pages and asked, Kei, what if they don't make sure I'm already dead before they try to burn me? Keigo frowned at the question before wiping one of his greasy hands on his pant leg to get as much grease off as he could before ruffling Izuku's hair, and then saying, if they don't, then I'm personally going to give them a whole lecture. I don't think they intentionally try to make sure we're in pain, and they've already learned that being burnt hurts like hell. And what if getting rid of my body actually kills me? Because we've come to the conclusion that my body builds up energy, keeping me dead, before I suddenly wake up. So what if there's no body to build up energy, and I just don't come back? Keigo's frown deepens, his eyebrows furrowing. A few moments passed, and Keigo seemed unable to think of a response. There wasn't much they could do if Izuku was permanently dead, after all, and the proof of his existence would just be a pile of ashes. And then Keigo leans forward, pulling Izuku into a one-armed hug. You go ahead and take your shower, Stinky. And make sure you get some rest too. I've got to talk with the Prees for a bit, but I'll try to find you before they have you do anything, Kei. Izuku gives Keigo a small smile before he nods, pushing himself off the floor, walking around his room as he gathers a change of clothes. Keigo takes that as his time to leave, bidding his farewells as he walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Everything Izuku would really need was in his room, other than food. And most of the time, it was brought up to him. So, Izuku really only found himself in his room, up until he was training or testing out his quirk again. That meant that there was nowhere Izuku needed to go when he needed to take a shower, with a bathroom that connected to his room. It was a nice room, but it was far too familiar lately. There were only so many ways that the furniture could be rearranged and still feel different. As soon as Izuku was done with his shower, though, he was quick to collapse onto his bed. Most of the time, a shower could wake him up. But this time, all it did was make him even more exhausted. So it didn't take long for him to pass out once he laid down. Once he woke up, he wasn't too sure how long it had been. All he knew was that the sun was starting to set, making Izuku wonder why he hadn't been woken up yet. He usually didn't nap that long, nor was he usually able to when he was being pulled back to training. After all, without a combat-oriented quirk, he had to put twice as much work in at least to make sure he could be one of the best. It's what he's here for after all, to be one of the best. He quickly shot off of his bed, deciding he would make the familiar path to where they usually tested out the different ways he could die and come back. But only started that journey once he had his notebook in hand for these tests. He would need to update it again, after all, and often asked about how the test would go before he was actually killed. That way he could have some notes beforehand, all the things he would need. Not to mention, he woke up pretty groggy, and often nearly forgot to update the pages in his notebook when he first woke up. It was on his journey that he heard a couple people walking down a connecting hallway, and he quickly stopped walking once he heard his name, backing himself up against the wall as he listened. "Burnt alive, I hear," one of them says. "Wouldn't it work just as well to have him dead already? It would definitely save the kid some pain if they just make sure he's dead already," the other replies. "I don't know. I don't really think that they need to test this many methods. You would think that they already figured out within the first year of these experiments that he just keeps coming back. Seems unnecessary at this point. Hey, I'm just telling you what I hear. And besides, some of the deaths are repeats anyway, to see how quickly he'll come back that time. Plus, from what I've heard, he's come back days quicker from some of the previous deaths over the years. Okay, well, that's been learned. I just think burning him alive is taking it too far. Well, I'm not in charge of him or these tests. If they want to make the kid mad at them because of some unnecessary suffering, it's their choice, and not me who did it." It was really tempting to think that the commission wouldn't go that far, burning him alive. Especially if Keigo was here today, and could very possibly serve as a reminder as the last time they used fire against one of them. But there was such a deep worry in his head that they actually would do it. Say it was some kind of lesson so he could learn the pain of fire. Make him know that he didn't want to get himself stuck in it. Was hearing about it from Keigo not enough? Fire already made Izuku nervous after hearing Keigo's stories, so he can only imagine how Keigo felt after actually feeling fire. So Izuku took one step back as the voices continued to get closer, and then another. One more, and then he turned on his heel, running back in the direction he came. Maybe he could try to find Keigo, run to him and try to make sure that the commission actually had some sense. No, it was already late. How much time would Izuku have before he was being dragged off anyway? As Izuku ran into his room, still trying to figure out what to do, he ran into Gushika, who was clearly looking around the room for Izuku. "There you are, kiddo. I came to get you a couple hours ago, but figured you needed more rest for today's test," Gushika explained, missing the horrified expression Izuku held on his face as he realized his time to think of a plan was drastically reduced. Gushika already had gently placed his hand on Izuku's back, starting to walk the two of them out of the room as he continued to speak. "Hawks already had to leave, but he tried to wait a while for you to wake up." No, Keigo was gone. But he has to get ready for his next mission. and needed to head back to his agency to get all of that organized. Gushika continued to explain. Izuku eyed his window as he was led out of his room, taking note of the building nearby, where the roof was conveniently rather close to Izuku's window. Izuku needed out. So, as they walked out, he put his training into practice as he quickly kicked the man in the back of the knee, his hand leaving Izuku's back as he kneeled down on the ground, collapsing to it as Izuku delivered another kick, and then quickly turning back into his room before he could see if Gushika was upset or knocked out. It definitely seemed, so far, that fighting against his last trainer of the day made taking down Gushika much easier than Izuku would have thought. He slammed his door shut, locking it and quickly dragging a chair to sit underneath the handle, and then bolted towards the window. It was funny how he never tried to open it before. But now was the time to do so, and he needed to take the risk. It was as he quickly perched himself up on the windowsill that he was suddenly beyond nervous. He wasn't very close to the ground floor at all, and the longer he stared down, the further the ground seemed. The gap between his window and the roof of the building next to it just looked further and further. But it was too risky to just try to squeeze his eyes shut and make the jump. Instead, Izuku just took in a deep, shaky breath of air and then launched himself off of the windowsill, grateful for the pain he felt shoot through his legs as he landed on the rooftop. But it was still far too close to the commission building. He wasn't sure how long he had until they busted down his door, or used another nearby room when they realized that Izuku was running off. He spent so long grateful for the opportunity he was given, beyond glad that he was being trained next to such powerful individuals to be a hero, the thing he had always wanted to be. But Izuku was scared, and no amount of admiration for heroes or their career was going to make him want to turn around and get burnt alive. If it wasn't the plan before, it almost surely was now, when he had rebelled against them more than he ever had before. He was actively running off, and had done so much more than a few snarky remarks. So he continued to run, leaping from building to building. No more death tests. No more waking up early just to train. No more having to prepare for the death to hit, sitting there in anticipation as he waited to be killed again. He never would understand why and how they were thinking of so many different methods. Yes, it had proven useful in notes over the years to see that the quirk improves, but it never stopped hurting. It was on that train of thought that he realized he was still tightly holding onto his notebook, and how the cover was already getting scratched up as he clumsily jumped from one rooftop to the next. He leapt onto another, and continued to think of the things he wanted to avoid. But really, the deaths were a major part. There were things that felt so freeing right now, though. The thoughts of the freedom he hardly realized he needed, hardly wanting to consider himself trapped in the building that he had spoken himself into. The sacrifices he didn't know he would make when he was little, and he would pay them back by calling himself trapped. It felt insulting to those sacrifices in his mind, but he couldn't help feeling free. As he continued to run, the soreness he would surely feel later not catching up to him quite yet, the more enjoyment he found as he leapt from one building to the next. He hadn't been out of the building in so long, and he may feel overwhelmed by all the noises out here, all of the things he'd be unable to predict after growing so used to a near-constant schedule. But that didn't matter right now. It probably wouldn't matter to him for much of the night. At least, that's what he was thinking until arms suddenly grabbed him from under his armpits, pulling him close to whoever grabbed him, and stopping his retreat from the commission building. He had gotten so far to... Izuku screamed as he was lifted into the air, kicking his feet in the air as his fingers dug into thick sleeves. It was as if his body couldn't decide if he wanted to cling on for dear life as they got higher and higher, or take the risk and fall back to the ground. He had already done well with one other hard landing, so surely it would be fine again if he hit the ground from. How high was he now? "Put me down," he shouted, still clinging onto the sleeved arms even tighter. He stared down at the ground in fear, watching as it got further and further, He hadn't been this high off the ground for this long, not even when he had to jump to his death to see how long the damage from that may take. It had just been a quick leap, and then things were done. This was horrifying. The speed at which he was flown through the air blew his hair back worse than jumping across buildings did, and his eyes squinted shut at the force of the wind. "Please," Izuku continued to shout, trying to peel his eyes away from the ground to look up at Keigo instead. "Just put me down." Finally looking up at Keigo, he watched as the person who he basically saw as a brother continued to look straight, never turning them around to go back in the direction that Izuku came from. He never looked down, but kept a firm grip on Izuku. It wasn't until a few minutes later that they finally started to descend, landing on a rooftop. The second their feet met the ground, Izuku all but collapsed as soon as they landed, laying down on the solid ground that he was so glad to meet again, without finding himself injured. "Sorry," Keigo started, squatting down next to Izuku and gently placing his hand on Izuku's head full of green curls. "I've learned that most people's first flight isn't always the best." Izuku was tempted to say, "No shit," but was too focused on digging his fingers into the rooftop, as if he was going to plant himself there. "But we're even further from the commission now. And I fly pretty fast, so I don't think they'll be finding us here for a while," Keigo continues, finally fully sitting down to make himself more comfortable. Maybe it became obvious that they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. When Izuku finally looked up, he saw the small frown Keigo had on his face before he turned away, placing his chin against the palm of his hand, and then saying, "I don't plan on dragging you back to the commission. You must have your reasons for running off. And would I really be looking out for you if I took you back? Especially when I haven't heard from you what happened." Izuku, still trying to catch his breath, as if he had been actually doing much other than flailing around and getting plenty of air to breathe up in the air, took it as his turn to look away. He didn't say anything though, fidgeting with the laces on his shoes, tugging at one end as if he was going to untie them, then pulling at the other end to loosely put it back in place. They still eventually came undone anyway. The silence between them continued to go on, waiting for one of them to be the one to break it, with neither seeming to open up any time soon. It was Keigo who moved though, shuffling closer until he could pull Izuku into a hug. Izuku definitely wasn't keeping track of how long that hug lasted, but he had no plans of pulling away from the one person he had been finding so much comfort in over the years. "You did a pretty good number on Gushika," Keigo said with a chuckle, finally breaking the long stretch of quiet. "I was right outside the building, about to fly off when it went over the comms that you were running off. Overheard it from the security that was right outside the door. Flew up and saw Gushika hobbling over to your window." Izuku snorted at the thought of it, and then asked, "Didn't try to chase?" "Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But it looked like he had spent a lot of that time trying to bust down your door," Keigo replied, pulling Izuku closer into the hug. "I took a little stop to ask about what was going on while others went to try to catch up to you. I stayed behind for a bit though to try to figure out what was going on. Though, they're telling me that you ran off for no reason at all." The smile that had been slowly forming on Izuku's face as Keigo continued to speak suddenly fell, and he looked up at the blonde and said, "It wasn't for no reason." Keigo hummed in agreement, tilting his head to the side in a small nod as he said, "I figured. Would you like to be the one to catch me up on what happened after your nap time?" Izuku looked away again. "Listen, I'm telling you what I know, and will continue to keep telling you. I just need some help on your part, Izu." "They weren't going to kill me first," Izuku muttered as he continued to bury his face in Keigo's jacket. He could feel the flying hero stiffen, going still, even with the lack of much context in Izuku's words. He didn't need context, not when it was a conversation that they were already having earlier in the day, something that they were both already worried about. "I didn't want to die like that," Izuku continued, feeling the tears well up in his eyes. He was already beyond well aware that he cried easily, as was Keigo. But he would still hate to make Keigo's hero suit all tear-stained. So he moved his head to where he was just facing down. That way any tears that may fall wouldn't just soak up in the jacket. Dying was already a horrifying concept in the first place. Being able to come back from the dead, knowing that that was an ability of his, it made it less scary. But it didn't eliminate all the fear, especially in the anticipation, the wait for the pain to come. The only thing he had been able to do was hope it was brief. But this time wouldn't have even given him that. That seemed to be all Keigo needed to know. A thing he could easily understand, despite the fact that this part of their worlds was one of the most different things in their similar lives, as they had been for the past 10 years. It definitely helped that Izuku had gone to Keigo for basically anything over the years, and they had confided in each other about whatever things had been like with the commission lately. Because that was basically all they had grown to know, the only thing they could share with one another. And then Keigo got to become a pro-hero, and he could check on Izuku with more stories to share. I know, I know, Keigo said. He let the hug last a little while longer, before gently placing his hands on Izuku's shoulders, moving him back as he said, I can't do much for you tonight, and I'm going to need you to keep yourself safe. But when I figure out more things, I'll let you know. Just expect the commission to send a lot of heroes after you. Don't trust many people. Not until I make sure they're not after you. You couldn't figure that out before you flew after me? You fly fast enough that they should have told you something, right? Izuku quickly questions, the worry quickly showing in his expression. No, they're not trusting me with that yet. Just try to hide where you think even I won't find you. That's the best way I can think for you to hide well. The roofs may seem safe for now, but as soon as it gets darker, the underground heroes are going to be up here. Izuku nodded as Keigo talked, watching as he pulled his wallet out of his pocket and handed over some money. It's not much, but hopefully it'll get you somewhere to stay tonight. I'll try to find you again soon. That way I can get you some more. Please, stay safe, Keigo pleaded, grabbing Izuku's shaky hands and putting the money in them. No place is really safe, not now that you've run off. We know how controlling they can be, so try to enjoy some freedom. Now run. It didn't take much more from Keigo for Izuku to start running, trying to get the shakiness down as much as he could, so he could safely jump from one building to the next, up until he saw one with a door that he could run through, making his way down and out onto the streets. It felt so open though, and so he hid himself into the alleyways, eyes frantically scanning every building he was able to see in hopes that there was somewhere he could stay. Alleys weren't a permanent hiding place though, and Izuku found himself on the dark streets more often than not. His hands held tight onto his arms, eyes darting in every direction as he tried to make sure that there were no heroes nearby. Keigo had flown him far, but he still had no clue just how many heroes were told to look for him. What if all nearby cities had been told to look for him? No place was safe. Not a single place was safe. The decision felt so foolish, so stupid. A decision for his own safety. But this worry that he felt over being dragged in just made him feel like he was going to worry himself to death, and then be dragged back to be killed again. It was when he was considering just finding some box to hide under for the night that he saw an internet cafe and a small shop right next to it. He looked over the baggy t-shirt and sweatpants he wore, bunching up the hems of his shirt in his shaky fists, before rushing across the street, grateful for the lack of any cars passing, as he ran towards the internet cafe first, checking with how much it would cost to stay for a night, before he ran to the next door store, quickly making his way over to some simple, cheap clothes, and putting together some of the extra money to buy something new. It wasn't much, and hardly differed much from what he was already wearing. But it was different enough, and it could make the tiniest difference. It was warm outside, but he needed to be able to hide himself. The hoodie was a need in his mind, and he could just risk overheating if it meant that he could hide his hair. Probably the biggest thing that could be used to identify him. Not every place was hot either, and he had plenty of plans to go hide, so he could continue walking around with another pair of sweatpants. These ones thinner than the ones he was currently wearing, that were actually supposed to keep him warm. Thankfully, the internet cafe was rather cool, and was nice to hide in for tonight. He wouldn't trust the commission to not check the cameras in as many places as they could. Try to track him down the second they found him in one. He just had to hope Kago wouldn't get caught. The internet cafe was definitely on a quiet part of town, and hardly anybody was there. He didn't know where he was, but he would try to figure it out soon enough. If he got lucky, he had been flown to another city, somewhere that the commission may not have thought he'd reached by now. Izuku just had to trust in Kago. He could keep trusting Kago, right? He had to. Who else could help make sure that things were going to go okay for him out here? It's not like he could get a job to support himself. He wasn't old enough, for one thing, and if he tried to register for anything anywhere, he would surely be found quickly. Kago was his only support out here. As he tried to get comfortable for the night, he looked at the small amount of money left, counting it, and hoping that it would be good enough for a meal in the morning. It didn't even have to be all that good, as long as it was enough. He placed his head in his hands as he mentally berated himself for this stupid idea. This is so stupid, he thought. Why did I run off without any kind of plan at all? Heroes don't just run. They step right into danger, put themselves at risk for others. He felt like a coward. But he tried to tell himself that this was something okay to be afraid of, to want to run away from. Because dying wasn't doing anything for anyone. Izuku looked at his notebook, the thing that he had hardly remembered holding for most of his escape. He was really starting to wonder how it had stayed with him, despite the fact that he was sure that there were multiple occasions he had put it down, times where he needed both hands, and never remembered picking it up. Hesitantly, he reached towards the notebook, sliding it off of the nearby table he had left it on, and turned it in his hands, looking over the item that carried so many important notes from over the years. That was when he spotted the small amount of bright red sticking out, and how it carefully went over a few pages before tucking itself between others. Kago. Kago had made sure that it stuck with him, probably trying to keep check on it after he had lifted Izuku into the air. This wasn't something to just leave lying around, and they both knew it. He would definitely have to thank Kago for making sure it stuck around with him when he saw him again. It was hard to get himself to sleep that night. Nothing really felt comfortable enough, and he spent just about every few minutes quickly opening his eyes to stare out the closest window his eyes could land on. The commission probably didn't expect him to have any money, so Kago had probably put him a step ahead. But it didn't put a stop to the anxiety that they had found him. Did they have anything or anyone capable to track him down well? Something that could dig into any cameras and try to find him? What if they already knew he was here, and were just waiting until he was asleep to drag him out? He needed sleep, though. The nap was enough to keep him awake for a while, but it wasn't enough to let him last through the night, especially when he knew that he needed to be awake through the day and find a better spot to hide. Somewhere cheap, preferably, or costing no money at all. Were there any good abandoned places in the city? Maybe an area hardly patrolled by heroes. A million questions whirred through his mind, and eventually, he had managed to pass out until sometime around lunch. When he had realized the time, he grabbed the notebook, tucking it under his arm as he started to quickly make his way out of the building. He was still pretty tired, and couldn't help but keep rubbing at his eyes, especially whenever he yawned. Izuku was also hungry. Hungry and tired, he quickly learned, was not a great combination. He had gotten lucky that the internet cafe he found had some beds, so that had made his night at least a little bit comfier. But a bed to sleep on wasn't enough to make him feel well rested, so he needed to find something to keep him awake. The first thing he had done was take a quick, warm shower. That had only helped a bit, so he went to grab some soda before he bolted out of the building. With the hood over his head, slowly sipping on the soda as he didn't have anything else to fill his stomach for now, he started to go through the steadily filling streets. He had no clue where he was at still, but in a way, it seemed familiar. He hadn't been anywhere outside of the commission base in 10 years, and hardly remembered much before then. But this place had a sense of familiarity, just not enough that he would know where he was going, even with sunlight pouring down. Once more, he took to the alleys. They didn't feel as safe with the sunlight beating down on just about everything, lighting up just about every direction he went in. Nothing was safe. That was something he couldn't stop reminding himself of over and over ever since Keigo told him to trust no one. It was on his walk that his lack of dinner last night, breakfast this morning, and so far, lack of lunch, were catching up to him. Izuku felt so much more aware of every restaurant he passed. The way the smell of the food was something so easy to smell. Eventually, he couldn't help himself and dug out the last of the money he had, counting it, and then peeking out of the alleyway he was currently hiding in hopes that he could see the price of a meal in one of the nearby ones. Just enough. He was really starting to wonder how he would make it through the rest of the day, or however long it would take for him to see Keigo again. But Izuku was hungry, and nothing was going to stop him from getting this one meal. He was grateful for the money Keigo had given him, but knew it wasn't enough. Within all fairness, Keigo wasn't expecting Izuku to run away, and had just taken out a handful of cash in hopes that it would help. So he crossed the street, rushing to the restaurant, and quickly trying to hunt down one of the cheapest meals on the menu. There was already a small line, so he didn't need to worry about being too quick with his choice. It was much to his own surprise that there were a few things to choose from at the same small price he had come here looking for, and eventually managed to determine which one he wanted best. As he waited for his food, all of that walking around made him realize that he really wanted to take a seat. So he did, hoping that the downtime and being in the small restaurant could lessen his nerves a bit, let him relax before he started looking for somewhere safe again. An abandoned building really was the best idea he could think of, but he would have to hope that he wouldn't draw any attention to it, in case someone like a hero, possibly well aware that nobody should be in it, noticed there was, in fact, someone hiding in it, and then investigated. All it would take is for them to take him to the police station, and the commission would probably be here in minutes. He would just have to make sure he didn't get caught. After all, his only other option right now was to look for a place he could stay in legally, and that would cost money. Something he was already just barely getting by with. Keigo would find him later today, or sometime tomorrow, right? Izuku looked at the last bits of money in his hand, thinking it would be enough for something small tonight, and knew he would really have to appreciate what would probably be his one actual meal of the day. His fingers drummed against the table he waited at impatiently, but quietly. He was hungry and tired of waiting, but not enough of either to want to draw attention to himself. Sure, running away felt stupid, but again, he didn't want to be dragged back. Moving on to a quieter task, he started fidgeting with his hoodie, especially the hood, in hopes that it hid his hair enough that it wasn't something that could be noticed at first sight. He hadn't seen any heroes down here yet, but it didn't mean that they didn't exist at all down here. Not to mention, some of them could just be off duty, but already knew to look for him after hearing about it sometime last night, or even earlier today. God, not knowing who can be trusted was so stressful. And so far, being stressed was just making him more hungry. 3 consistent meals a day. And now he was just betting on the one for today to get him through. Well, he had done worse hungrier. That was probably the best train of thought Izuku could lead himself on to make him feel better about his situation. And then finally, his food was done. He had happily taken it with a smile before taking his seat again, almost starting to scarf down the entire thing, until he realized halfway through that he should probably start taking his time. That way it feels more filling. But of course, things couldn't continue to go right, could they? Not that there were a series of things going right today, but the food was going to be a good start. No, there just had to be heroes walking in. It was beyond obvious that the two were as well, dressed in their costumes and all. He didn't recognize either, probably two heroes that had somewhat recently debuted. One was a woman with long blonde hair, her bodysuit mainly purple and white. She walked alongside a man whose costume was wood, or he himself was wood. But the second option was probably the one, considering there were actual clothes that still looked like a costume over all of the wood. Izuku kept his head down for the most part, staring intently at his food, and hoping that it wasn't obvious that he was intentionally avoiding looking at the heroes. What didn't help was that the rest of the restaurant seemed to recognize the heroes, a few eagerly walking over for autographs, while others excitedly whispered about how one of them had debuted today. Well, he was right when it came to knowing one of them was new. He wondered how new the other one was. Either way, he had figured out one of them was Mount Lady, who was excitedly signing autographs, despite how it hindered her progress in the line. Kamui Woods, the other hero, seemed less eager to sign anything. "Come on, it's fun," Mount Lady said to the wooden hero. "Don't be so sour that I took down that giant villain this morning." Kamui Woods just shrugged before he turned back to facing the menu. Izuku slowly moved his notebook closer, sliding it off the table, and then putting it on his lap. The chair next to him was definitely an option, but that put it at risk of someone else grabbing it. What someone would do with a regular-looking notebook at first glance, he didn't know. But with how many stories Keigo would tell him with criminals and villains, he had no doubt some people would just do the craziest things for seemingly no reason at first. So, the notebook was being kept close. The noodles he had ordered were finally starting to cool down a bit more, that each bite wasn't on the verge of being too hot to eat. But it's not like the heat had really bothered him earlier. Izuku definitely wasn't going to sit around and wait much longer for it to cool. "Are you paying for yourself?" Kamui Woods whispered to Mount Lady, their spot in the line just a couple feet away from where Izuku sat. It took everything in him to not tense up, startled at the realization that the heroes were right there. "Well, Mount Lady started with a nervous chuckle. "You see, I haven't really gotten paid yet. And, Kamui Wood sighed, and then said, "And here I was thinking I was going to be treated to a late lunch after this morning. Hey, the situation just looked like it could use a bit of help." "I had it under control," he muttered, seemingly still upset about whatever villain fight had happened this morning, his voice bitter as he stuffed his hands in his pockets. Okay, you had it under control," Mount Lady says, her voice light and making an attempt to be cheerful. "You'll help me with lunch today though, right? I'll treat you to a good lunch when I get paid." "Fine." The conversation was amusing, but not enough to stop him from the fear he felt with the heroes there. In fact, his eating had returned to being quick, swiftly running out of the building the moment the bowl was completely empty. It was as he was leaving that he heard them talking about another villain running around recently, but had missed just which hero was around and taken on the chase for the villain. This part of the city was definitely too busy for anywhere to hide, so he had to make his way even further into the city. Maybe towards the edge. How would he find the edge? He doesn't even know where he is. Maybe one of the first steps would be to look at the names on buildings for once today. Actually look at the boards and papers put on the walls of buildings, whether they were out in the open or in alleyways. That was probably the best way to figure out where he was, since he didn't plan on talking to anyone else. Tucking the notebook under his arm, he turned back into another alleyway, winding down the street, especially now that they were getting busier. When he had run out of alleyway to hide in for now, he peeked into one of the buildings that had a TV in the window, the news playing and able to quietly be heard through the window. With the time at the bottom, he realized it was best to assume that people were starting to be let out of school, and that was what was making everything pretty busy right now. Well, with the streets this covered in people for now, it was probably the best time to be out in the open, able to hide between everyone and blend in. It felt a little bit faster since he wasn't busy making one turn after the next through alleys, trying to keep himself in them. In fact, he had actually been able to find out that he was in Musutafu, which had immediately brought him some sense of relief. He may not have had many memories of the place, but it definitely explained why it was familiar. It was the city he had spent about the first 4.5 years of his life in. It didn't change the fact that he didn't know how to get through the city anymore. Everything familiar but so unrecognizable at the same time. He was sure that if he saw something like his old apartment, he would know. But right now, he didn't see anything like that. It was just a busy street in what was probably near the middle of the city. Eventually, he had started to make his way back towards a quieter part of the city and found himself walking under a bridge, messing with the edges of his notebook as he walked. He finally was managing to keep himself from staring at the floor, trying to get a good look at all of the buildings. But of course, luck wasn't on his side. It made it well aware that there really wasn't much that would go right today, as soon as the manhole cover started to rattle right behind him. He had already been taught to pay good attention to his surroundings, not just let any minor noise slide, as it could be something major that he had missed in an attempt to pretend like it was nothing. He quickly turned to see what it was, knowing there wasn't any good reason that a manhole cover should be moving. It didn't clatter against the concrete for long before it was suddenly tossed into the air by a thick, green sludge. Izuku started to back away, turned to run. But the sludge was fast, already having been on the move for what may have been a long while. Meanwhile, Izuku was still trying to gain speed in the 2 seconds he had before the sludge suddenly got a hold of him, pulling him back. The sludge seemed to pant as it got a hold of Izuku, who was desperately trying to kick it off. A medium-sized body. To hide in, it panted out, before suddenly lunging at Izuku. Despite all of the avoiding he had done against heroes, right now, all he wanted won as he screamed, knowing there was nothing he could do right now against the villain. He would survive this, whether he died first or not. Suffocation was one of his least favorite ways he had died, but it was one of the quickest to come back from. Maybe it would be even quicker than last time, since the test for that death had been years prior, and he had already gotten steadily faster at coming back from the dead. However, he was also dead on energy, and didn't have enough food in his system to replace that missing energy. If anything, it may mean that it takes either the same amount of time, or even longer. He clawed uselessly at the sludge as he wondered if this was the villain that was being chased earlier. If so, who was the hero taking care of this? Don't worry, the villain started. I'm just hijacking your body. Calm down. Oh yeah, silly me. I'm so calm right now as I'm being suffocated, Izuku screamed in his head, glaring at the creepy yellow and red eye that peered at him. He swung at hit, managing to get the sludge off of him just enough that he could get a breath in, trying to cough out some of it as he heard the villain shout in pain. And then out a hero came in a huge gust of wind, their large hand grabbing onto Izuku as the sludge was suddenly blown away, splattered in multiple parts under the bridge. As Izuku tried to cough out what he could feel still inside his lungs, catching some of the sludge in his hand as he did so, the hero's hand moved from the arm he wasn't coughing into to one of his shoulders instead, firmly rested there as the hero crouched down to get to eye level, asking, "Young man, are you okay?" Izuku's eyes widened, and all he could think was, well shit. Today couldn't get any worse, could it? Of course All Might had to be here.